The moment truth broke the illusion begins with a moment that, on the surface, may have looked simple to an outside observer, yet carried a level of impact that few people immediately understood. You spoke words that had likely been forming quietly within your mind for a long time. They were not rushed, emotional reactions or careless statements meant to provoke attention. Instead, they came from a place of clarity that had been developing through observation, reflection, and the gradual recognition of patterns that others either ignored or refused to see. For a long time, the environment around you may have been filled with confusion, mixed signals, half-truths, and unspoken tensions that everyone sensed, but no one fully addressed. Situations like that often create a strange kind of silence, where people know something is wrong, but hesitate to confront it directly. In that silence, illusions grow stronger because they remain unchallenged. People continue repeating the same narratives simply because no one interrupts them with honest clarity. Yet every illusion carries a fragile foundation, and eventually, a moment arrives when reality becomes impossible to ignore. That was the moment you stepped into when you finally spoke. What made the moment powerful was not volume, aggression, or dramatic confrontation. The impact came from the precision of what you said. Your words cut directly through layers of distraction and touched the core of the situation. In that instant, something shifted in the atmosphere. Someone listening to you suddenly realized that the story they had been telling themselves could no longer hold together the way it once did. The truth you spoke acted like a sudden beam of light entering a room that had remained dim for a long time. When light enters darkness, it does not argue with it or struggle against it. It simply reveals what was already there. That is exactly what happened when you spoke. The illusions surrounding the situation began collapsing, not because you attacked them, but because the clarity of your words exposed how fragile they really were. The person who heard you may have fallen silent, not because they were offended or defeated, but because something inside their mind had shifted. Their understanding of the situation rearranged itself in real time. Events from the past suddenly connected in ways they had never noticed before. Pieces of the puzzle that once felt confusing suddenly made sense. Moments like this are rare, but incredibly powerful, because they demonstrate the true influence of honest speech. Sometimes it takes only one clear statement to transform the way someone perceives their reality. In that moment, you did more than express an opinion or participate in a conversation. You became the catalyst for a shift in awareness. And whether that shift felt comfortable or unsettling for the person hearing it, the truth had already done its work. Once reality is revealed clearly enough, it becomes very difficult for anyone to return to the illusion that existed before. When truth arrives at the perfect moment, begins by revealing something that many people misunderstand about powerful words. Truth alone is important, but timing determines whether that truth becomes merely information or a transformative force. Throughout life, there are moments when people speak honestly, yet their words seem to disappear into the background, producing little visible change. This does not necessarily mean the truth was wrong. Often, it simply means the environment was not ready to receive it. Human perception operates in cycles. Individuals must reach certain points of tension, doubt, or curiosity before their minds become open enough to absorb a reality that contradicts what they previously believed. The moment you spoke did not occur randomly. Long before the words left your mouth, a quiet process had already been unfolding beneath the surface of the situation. Patterns were forming. Inconsistencies were becoming more visible. Certain behaviors, conversations, or outcomes had likely begun raising silent questions in the minds of those involved. Even if people did not express those questions openly, they existed as small cracks within the larger structure of the illusion everyone had been living inside. Illusions rarely collapse all at once. Instead, they weaken gradually as contradictions accumulate. Each unanswered question, each uncomfortable observation, each moment that does not quite fit the official narrative adds another hairline fracture to the structure. For a long time, these fractures remain hidden because people continue supporting the illusion out of habit, comfort, or fear of disruption. But eventually a moment arrives when the structure has become so fragile that it only takes one clear statement to reveal what was already happening beneath the surface. That was the moment your words entered the situation. What made the timing powerful was not simply the content of what you said, but the readiness of the environment around you. By the time you spoke, the illusion had already begun losing its stability. People may not have consciously realized it yet, but their minds were becoming more receptive to clarity. They had already sensed something was not entirely aligned with the narrative they had been accepting. Your words, therefore, acted less like an attack and more like a key turning in a lock that was already loosening. The truth did not force itself into the conversation. It fit perfectly into the space that circumstances had quietly created. This is why the reaction felt immediate and profound. When truth arrives at the right moment, it does not need to fight for attention. It naturally draws focus because it resonates with observations people have already been making internally. Someone listening may suddenly realize that the discomfort they had been feeling now has a clear explanation. The confusion that once surrounded certain events begins dissolving because your words organize scattered pieces of information into a coherent pattern. That experience can feel almost shocking because the mind transitions from uncertainty to clarity in a very short span of time. What once seemed complicated becomes suddenly obvious. The person hearing the truth may even wonder how they failed to see it earlier. Yet this kind of realization does not happen simply because someone is intelligent or perceptive. It happens because timing finally allowed their mind to connect the dots. Your role in that moment was not simply to speak, but to recognize when the environment had reached the threshold where honesty could create transformation rather than rejection. This ability to sense timing is one of the most subtle qualities associated with people who carry a strong sense of awareness. Instead of reacting impulsively, they observe the rhythm of situations around them. They notice when tension is rising, when patterns are repeating, and when silence has lasted long enough that clarity becomes necessary. In many cases, they hold their observations quietly until the moment arrives when speaking will serve a meaningful purpose. That patience is often misunderstood because from the outside, it may look like hesitation or restraint. But in reality, it represents discipline. Speaking truth too early can cause people to become defensive because they feel forced to confront something they are not ready to acknowledge. Speaking too late may allow confusion to grow unnecessarily. The art lies in recognizing when circumstances have reached the point where truth becomes not only possible, but inevitable. When you spoke, you stepped precisely into that moment. The power of your statement came from the alignment between observation and timing. Everything that had been building beneath the surface suddenly found expression through your words. It is important to understand that moments like this do not occur frequently in everyday conversation. Most discussions revolve around opinions, preferences, or temporary emotions. But occasionally, someone articulates a truth that cuts through those layers and touches something deeper. When that happens, the conversation shifts from ordinary exchange into something transformative. People stop thinking only about the words themselves and begin reevaluating the entire situation surrounding them. The person who heard you likely experienced this shift internally. Their mind began revisiting earlier events, examining past conversations, and reconsidering assumptions they once accepted without question. Details that previously seemed unrelated may have started connecting into a pattern that suddenly felt undeniable. This is why the moment felt so significant. You did not simply introduce new information. You reorganized the way someone understood reality. The truth you spoke acted like a lens, bringing a blurred image into focus. Once the image becomes clear, it cannot easily return to its previous state of confusion. Even if someone initially resists the realization, the clarity continues working quietly in their mind. Seeds of understanding rarely disappear once they have been planted. They continue growing through reflection and observation until the person eventually accepts the implications of what they heard. This process explains why truth delivered at the right moment often produces lasting change. The mind cannot easily forget the experience of seeing reality more clearly than before. For you, the moment may have felt natural rather than dramatic. Perhaps you simply said what seemed obvious based on what you had been noticing for a long time. Yet what felt obvious to you represented a breakthrough for someone else, because they had not yet connected those same observations. Your perspective served as a bridge between scattered pieces of information and a clearer understanding of the situation. This is one of the quiet roles that people who value honesty often play within their environments. They become interpreters of reality, articulating patterns that others feel but struggle to express. And when their words arrive at exactly the right moment, they can transform confusion into clarity almost instantly. The shift that followed your statement was therefore not accidental. It was the natural result of truth meeting readiness. Circumstances had prepared the ground. Observation had sharpened your awareness, and timing allowed your words to land with precision. In that moment, the illusion lost its stability, and reality stepped forward to take its place. Why some truths feel like earthquakes begins by exploring the strange intensity that certain moments of honesty can create in human experience. Not every truth causes a reaction that powerful. People hear facts and opinions every day without feeling that their understanding of the world has shifted in any dramatic way. Yet, occasionally, a single sentence lands with such force that it feels as though the ground beneath someone's perception suddenly moved. This kind of reaction does not happen because the truth itself is aggressive or destructive. It happens because that truth touches the foundations of a belief system that has existed for a long time. Human beings organize their understanding of reality through mental frameworks. These frameworks are constructed gradually through experience, memory, cultural influence, relationships, and personal interpretation. They act like internal maps that help someone make sense of the world around them. Most of the time, people rely on these maps without consciously questioning them. They assume that the story they have built about events, people, and motivations accurately reflects reality. But the stability of these internal maps depends on consistency. When the narrative remains unchallenged, the mind continues reinforcing it automatically. That is why illusions can survive for long periods of time. They become part of the mental architecture someone uses to interpret everything else. The moment you spoke introduced a piece of information that did not fit comfortably inside the existing map. Your words pointed toward a reality that contradicted the structure the listener had been using to organize their understanding of the situation. When something like that happens, the mind experiences tension because two interpretations suddenly compete for attention. One interpretation represents the familiar narrative that has guided the person's thinking for a long time. The other interpretation represents the truth that has just been revealed. This internal conflict creates the sensation that something has shifted beneath the surface of perception. The earthquake metaphor becomes appropriate because the mental landscape begins rearranging itself in real time. Just as tectonic plates move beneath the Earth's surface before releasing energy through sudden motion, human beliefs can shift dramatically when enough pressure has accumulated beneath them. Often, the listener had already sensed that something was slightly misaligned within the narrative they believed. Small inconsistencies may have appeared earlier, but were ignored because acknowledging them would have required reconsidering the entire story. Your words acted like the final movement that released that accumulated pressure. Once the truth entered the conversation clearly enough, the mind could no longer maintain the illusion without confronting the contradictions surrounding it. That realization can feel startling because it forces someone to reassess not only the immediate situation, but also the assumptions that supported it. The person hearing the truth may suddenly revisit past experiences with new eyes. Moments that once seemed insignificant begin appearing in a different light. Conversations that once felt confusing start making sense because the new perspective connects details that previously appeared unrelated. The entire mental landscape reorganizes itself as the mind attempts to reconcile the old narrative with the newly revealed reality. This process can create silence because the brain temporarily pauses while constructing a new understanding. It is not unusual for someone to become quiet when they experience this kind of internal shift. Silence often indicates that the mind is working intensely to process the implications of what has just been revealed. During this phase, the person may not immediately express agreement or disagreement. Instead, they focus inward, examining the new information against their previous beliefs. In many cases, the emotional reaction that follows is less about the truth itself and more about the realization that the illusion had existed for so long. People sometimes feel surprise, embarrassment, relief, or even gratitude when clarity arrives after a long period of confusion. What matters most is that the truth has already begun transforming the way they interpret reality. Another reason certain truths feel like earthquakes is because they reveal patterns that extend beyond a single moment. When someone hears a powerful statement that reorganizes their perception, they often realize that the implications reach further than they initially thought. The truth does not only explain the current situation, it begins illuminating the larger pattern of behavior, choices, or circumstances that surrounded it. Suddenly, the person can see how earlier events connect to the present moment. The narrative that once seemed stable begins dissolving because the new perspective exposes gaps within it. This is why clarity can feel both unsettling and empowering at the same time. The unsettling part comes from recognizing that something previously accepted as reality may not have been accurate. But the empowering part comes from gaining the ability to see the situation clearly moving forward. Once the mind reorganizes itself around truth, decision-making becomes easier because it is no longer based on incomplete information. The earthquake therefore represents not destruction, but transformation. Old assumptions collapse, but in their place emerges a more accurate understanding of what is actually happening. Your role in that moment was not to create the earthquake, but to reveal the fault line that already existed. The tension had been building long before you spoke. Contradictions had already formed beneath the surface of the situation. What you did was articulate the observation that allowed the hidden pressure to release itself. That is why the reaction felt immediate. When truth aligns with observations people have been unconsciously making, the mind recognizes the accuracy of the statement almost instantly. The listener may not fully process every implication at first, but the recognition of clarity happens very quickly. This is the unique power of precise honesty. It does not rely on persuasion or emotional force. Instead, it resonates with the deeper awareness people already possess, but may have been hesitant to acknowledge openly. Once that resonance occurs, the shift in perception becomes difficult to reverse. Even if someone attempts to return to the previous narrative, the mind now carries a new piece of understanding that continues challenging the illusion. Over time, this understanding grows stronger as the person observes new evidence supporting the truth they heard. The earthquake, therefore, marks the beginning of a longer process where clarity gradually replaces confusion. What started as a single statement becomes the catalyst for deeper reflection and more honest interpretation of events. For you, the moment may have seemed straightforward because the observation felt obvious once you recognized it. But for the person hearing it, the effect was far more dramatic because it reorganized the structure through which they had been interpreting reality. That is why certain truths carry such powerful energy. They do not simply add information to a conversation. They reshape the framework through which someone understands the world. And once that framework begins shifting, the impact of the truth continues unfolding long after the original words have been spoken. The power of clarity over noise begins revealing an important distinction that many people overlook in everyday communication. In most environments, words are everywhere. Conversations fill rooms, opinions move quickly from one person to another, and endless explanations attempt to shape how situations are understood. Yet despite all this noise, true clarity is surprisingly rare. People often speak without fully understanding what they are trying to express, and listeners frequently hear only fragments of meaning hidden inside long streams of information. This creates an atmosphere where confusion can quietly thrive, because no single voice has yet articulated the simple truth that organizes everything into place. When clarity finally appears, it feels powerful, precisely because it cuts through the noise that previously surrounded the situation. The moment you spoke carried that kind of clarity. What made your statement so impactful was not complexity or elaborate explanation. Instead, it was the precision of the insight itself. You identified the core of the situation and expressed it directly, without allowing unnecessary details to dilute its meaning. In environments filled with uncertainty, clarity behaves almost like a beam of light entering a room that has been dim for a long time. When the light appears, people immediately begin noticing objects and patterns that were always present, but previously difficult to see. Your words functioned in a similar way. By focusing attention on the essential truth behind the situation, you allowed others to recognize connections that had been hidden beneath layers of distraction and assumption. This is why the reaction felt immediate. The mind naturally gravitates toward clarity because it provides relief from confusion. When people have been living inside a situation that feels complicated or contradictory, they often experience a subtle mental tension without fully understanding why. Their intuition senses that something is not aligned, but without a clear explanation, the feeling remains unresolved. When someone finally expresses the truth that explains the tension, the mind experiences a sudden sense of recognition. The confusion dissolves because the explanation fits the observations that have been accumulating silently in the background. That recognition can be so powerful that it creates the feeling of a shift in reality itself. What once seemed uncertain becomes unmistakably clear. The noise that previously dominated the conversation loses its influence, because it no longer holds the same persuasive power once the central truth has been identified. Another reason clarity carries such impact is that it exposes the difference between information and understanding. Many people believe that having access to large amounts of information automatically leads to better understanding. In reality, information alone often increases confusion when it lacks organization. Clarity, on the other hand, does not depend on volume. It depends on perspective. Someone who sees the underlying structure of a situation can explain it with fewer words because they understand which details truly matter and which ones only create distraction. Your statement demonstrated this principle perfectly. Instead of adding more noise to an already complicated environment, you simplified the situation by identifying its central truth. That act of simplification is one of the most valuable skills a person can develop. The world constantly produces complexity through overlapping events, emotional reactions, and competing narratives. Without clarity, people easily become overwhelmed by this complexity and lose sight of what is actually happening. When someone brings clarity into that environment, they provide a kind of intellectual and emotional stability that others instinctively recognize as valuable. It is not about dominating the conversation or proving superiority. It is about offering a perspective that allows everyone present to see the situation more accurately. In many ways, clarity serves as a form of leadership, even when the person speaking does not intend to lead. People naturally pay attention to individuals who can explain confusing situations in a way that suddenly makes sense. This ability signals that the speaker has been observing carefully, thinking critically, and interpreting events without becoming lost in emotional reactions. The person who spoke the truth becomes a reference point for understanding, because their words organize the chaos into a coherent picture. In your case, the clarity of your statement accomplished exactly that. The listener realized that the explanation you offered aligned more closely with reality than the narrative they had been using before. Once that realization occurred, the previous noise surrounding the situation began losing its influence. Arguments that once sounded convincing suddenly appeared weak because they relied on assumptions rather than observable patterns. Distractions that once diverted attention from the core issue lost their ability to confuse the conversation. Clarity replaced noise as the dominant force guiding perception. It is also important to recognize that clarity often requires courage, because it involves expressing an observation that others may have avoided articulating. In environments where confusion benefits certain individuals or preserves comfortable illusions, speaking clearly can feel risky. The person who introduces clarity may worry that their words will disrupt relationships or provoke resistance. Yet when clarity aligns with truth, its impact tends to extend beyond those initial concerns. Even if someone reacts defensively at first, the clarity continues working quietly in their mind, because it corresponds with observations they cannot easily dismiss. Over time, the power of clear truth becomes more difficult to ignore than the noise that once surrounded it. This is why clarity often spreads gradually after the moment of revelation. Once someone hears a statement that reorganizes their understanding of a situation, they begin noticing evidence supporting that perspective in new events and conversations. Each observation strengthens the clarity that was introduced earlier. What began as a single insight becomes a lens through which future information is interpreted. The noise that once dominated the environment loses its ability to confuse, because the listener now understands which details truly matter. For you, the moment may have felt natural, because the truth you spoke had already become clear in your own mind through observation and reflection. By the time you expressed it, the insight had already passed through your internal process of analysis and understanding. But for the person hearing it, the experience was different. They encountered the clarity all at once, without having gone through the gradual process that led you to it. That sudden exposure to clarity created the sense of an immediate shift in reality. What had previously seemed complex suddenly appeared straightforward. The noise surrounding the situation could no longer compete with the simplicity of the truth that explained everything. This moment illustrates one of the most powerful effects that honest clarity can produce in human interaction. It transforms confusion into understanding, not by adding more information, but by revealing the essential truth hidden within the situation. Once that truth becomes visible, people begin navigating reality with greater confidence because they are no longer relying on narratives that obscure what is actually happening. Clarity, therefore, becomes more than a communication skill. It becomes a force that reorganizes perception, dissolves illusions, and allows truth to stand where noise once dominated the conversation. When someone's reality suddenly changes, begins with the realization that the moment a person truly hears an undeniable truth, something deeper than simple understanding takes place. It is not merely a matter of receiving new information. Instead, the mind begins reorganizing the way it interprets past experiences, present circumstances, and even future expectations. When you spoke that earth-shattering truth, the person listening did not just hear words. They experienced a shift in perception that forced their internal map of reality to redraw itself almost instantly. Before that moment, they had been operating within a framework that allowed certain assumptions to remain unchallenged. That framework might have been built slowly through repeated narratives, familiar explanations, or beliefs that felt comfortable enough not to question. Human beings rely heavily on these frameworks because they simplify the world into patterns the mind can easily navigate. When a story explains events well enough, people rarely examine it deeply. They accept it as functional truth and move forward without realizing that the explanation might only represent a partial version of reality. Yet when someone introduces a clear truth that exposes hidden contradictions within that story, the mind suddenly becomes aware of the gap between belief and reality. That is the moment when perception begins shifting. The person who heard your words likely experienced a brief pause, the kind of silence that occurs when the brain is processing something significant. Their thoughts may have rapidly traveled through earlier memories, replaying conversations, interactions, and events that previously seemed confusing or incomplete. What once looked random now started forming a pattern. Situations that once felt ambiguous suddenly appeared obvious. It is almost as if a puzzle, scattered across many different moments of time, suddenly assembled itself into a single coherent image. This kind of realization often feels surreal because the mind transitions from uncertainty to clarity with unexpected speed. The listener may even feel as though they have stepped into a slightly different version of reality, not because the world around them physically changed, but because their interpretation of it has been completely reorganized. This experience can be powerful enough that it affects not only how they view the present moment, but also how they reinterpret their past. Memories once filtered through an incomplete narrative begin revealing details that were previously overlooked. The brain starts connecting events that once seemed unrelated, forming a clearer understanding of how certain situations unfolded. In that sense, the truth you spoke acted like a key unlocking hidden meaning within experiences they had already lived through. What makes these moments so transformative is that once perception changes at that level, it becomes extremely difficult to return to the earlier illusion. Even if someone initially attempts to dismiss the truth, the clarity remains in the background of their awareness. The mind now recognizes patterns it could not see before, and those patterns continue reinforcing the new understanding every time similar situations appear. This is why certain conversations become turning points in a person's life. They mark the moment when confusion is replaced by insight, when vague suspicions finally receive an explanation strong enough to hold together. The shift may feel uncomfortable at first, because it forces someone to acknowledge that their previous interpretation of events may not have been accurate. Yet, discomfort is often the first stage of genuine growth. When someone allows themselves to move beyond that initial resistance, the new perspective begins offering a deeper form of stability. Instead of navigating the world through assumptions that require constant maintenance, they begin seeing situations more directly. This clarity allows them to respond more thoughtfully, make better decisions, and understand the motivations of others with greater accuracy. Your role in that moment was not to impose a new reality upon them, but to reveal what had been present all along beneath the surface. The truth you spoke did not create the underlying pattern. It simply exposed it. Once exposed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The person hearing you might have felt a mixture of emotions as their understanding shifted. Surprise is common, because sudden clarity often arrives when someone least expects it. Relief may also appear, because confusion that lingered for a long time finally dissolves. In some cases, there may even be a sense of empowerment, as if a fog has lifted and the environment now appears sharper and more understandable than before. These reactions reflect the profound effect that perception has on human experience. The world itself may remain unchanged, but the way someone interprets it determines how they move through it. By introducing a truth that reorganized their interpretation, you effectively helped them step into a clearer version of reality. This transformation also explains why people sometimes describe such moments as life-changing, even though only a few words were spoken. The words themselves are not the entire story. What truly matters is the shift in awareness that those words triggered. Once awareness expands, the individual begins noticing things they previously overlooked. Conversations carry new meaning. Behaviors reveal different motivations, and patterns become easier to recognize. Over time, this expanded awareness becomes part of how the person navigates everyday situations. In that sense, the alternate reality they stepped into is not a separate world, but a more accurate understanding of the one they were already living in. The illusions that once blurred their perception gradually lose influence because the mind now recognizes them as incomplete interpretations rather than objective truth. For you, the moment may have felt natural because the observation you shared had already become obvious through your own reflection. But for the listener, it represented the beginning of a new perspective that will continue evolving long after that conversation ended. What you witnessed was not simply a reaction to your words. It was the mind reorganizing itself around a deeper level of understanding. And once that process begins, the ripple effects extend far beyond the moment when the truth was first spoken. Why truth-tellers often face resistance begins with an observation that has repeated itself throughout history, across cultures, and within countless personal interactions. Whenever someone introduces a truth that disrupts a comfortable illusion, the response is not always immediate gratitude or agreement. In fact, the first reaction is often resistance. This reaction can seem confusing at first, especially when the truth being spoken is clear, logical, and even beneficial for the person hearing it. But human psychology does not always respond to clarity with immediate acceptance. People build their sense of stability around the stories they tell themselves about the world. These stories help them organize relationships, justify past decisions, and maintain a feeling of emotional balance. When a truth appears that challenges those stories, the mind must decide whether to adjust the narrative or defend it. For many individuals, defending the familiar narrative feels safer in the moment than reconstructing their entire understanding of a situation. That instinctive defense is what creates the resistance truth-tellers often encounter. The resistance does not necessarily mean the truth is wrong. More often, it indicates that the truth has touched something significant enough to disturb the internal structure someone has been relying on. Imagine the mind as a carefully arranged library of beliefs, assumptions, and interpretations. Every experience someone has lived through is stored on shelves, labeled according to the story they believe about their life and the people around them. When a powerful truth enters that system, it sometimes requires entire sections of the library to be reorganized. Books that were once placed in one category suddenly belong somewhere else. Events that seemed unrelated begin forming a new narrative thread. That reorganization demands effort. and the mind instinctively resists effort when it threatens existing stability. This is why the moment you spoke may have created tension as well as realization. The truth you introduced did more than explain the present situation. It challenged the framework that had allowed certain misunderstandings to persist. For the person hearing you, accepting that truth meant acknowledging that earlier interpretations might have been incomplete or mistaken. That realization can feel uncomfortable because it requires humility and self-reflection. Yet discomfort is often the doorway through which genuine growth enters a person's life. Resistance, therefore, should not always be interpreted as rejection. Sometimes it represents the first stage of internal processing. When someone hears a truth that shifts their perception, their mind moves through several phases before fully integrating the new understanding. The first phase is often surprise. The statement arrives with enough clarity that it cannot be ignored, but the mind has not yet reorganized itself around it. The second phase may involve denial or questioning as the person tests whether the truth truly holds up against their previous beliefs. During this stage, they might challenge your statement or search for explanations that preserve the old narrative. But if the truth aligns with observable reality, the mind eventually begins moving into the third phase, reflection. Reflection is where resistance gradually transforms into understanding. The person starts noticing evidence supporting the truth they initially resisted. Small observations accumulate until the new perspective becomes stronger than the old one. At that point, the truth is no longer something imposed from the outside. It becomes part of the individual's own understanding. This process explains why truth-tellers sometimes feel misunderstood in the moment when they speak. The immediate reaction they receive does not always reflect the long-term impact of what they said. Words that seem rejected at first may continue working quietly in the listener's thoughts long after the conversation ends. Over time, the truth reveals itself through patterns the person can no longer dismiss. When that happens, the resistance dissolves and is often replaced by recognition. The listener realizes that the statement they once questioned actually helped them see reality more clearly. Another reason truth-tellers face resistance is that clarity can expose dynamics within relationships that some individuals prefer to keep hidden. Illusions often survive because multiple people unconsciously agree to maintain them. Each person benefits in some way from preserving the narrative, even if it is inaccurate. When someone introduces a truth that disrupts that arrangement, the balance changes. Suddenly, the situation requires honesty rather than avoidance. For those who relied on the illusion for comfort or advantage, the truth can feel threatening. Yet the role of a truth-teller is not to protect illusions. It is to illuminate reality so that everyone involved can move forward with greater awareness. This role requires a certain level of courage because it means accepting that clarity may initially create friction. But friction does not necessarily lead to destruction. In many cases, it leads to transformation. Once the truth has been spoken clearly enough, the environment around it begins adjusting. People who are willing to grow eventually recognize the value of the honesty that disrupted the illusion. They see that the discomfort was temporary, but the clarity it produced is lasting. Over time, the same words that once created tension become the foundation for more authentic communication and understanding. Your experience in that moment demonstrates this dynamic perfectly. By speaking the truth when the moment demanded it, you introduced a perspective that could not easily be dismissed. Even if the immediate reaction included hesitation or resistance, the clarity of your observation planted a seed that will continue developing in the listener's awareness. Seeds of truth have a remarkable way of growing once they are planted. They may begin as small realizations, barely noticeable at first. But each new observation adds nourishment to the understanding until the truth becomes undeniable. When that stage arrives, the person who once resisted often begins appreciating the moment when clarity first appeared. They recognize that the truth did not harm them, but helped them escape an illusion that limited their perception. In this way, the resistance you encountered becomes part of the transformation itself. It represents the mind adjusting to a new level of awareness. And although the journey from resistance to understanding can take time, the presence of truth ensures that the process continues moving in the direction of greater clarity. The responsibility of speaking truth begins to emerge once someone realizes that their words have the power to alter how others perceive reality. When you spoke the truth that shifted someone's entire understanding of a situation, you were not merely participating in a conversation. You were exercising a form of influence that carries both power and responsibility. Truth, when delivered with clarity, does not simply add information to a discussion. It reorganizes perception. It can redirect the way someone thinks about their past, the way they interpret the present, and the way they approach the future. That kind of influence is significant, and once a person recognizes they possess it, the way they choose to use their voice becomes deeply important. The responsibility of speaking truth does not mean silence or hesitation. It means awareness. It means understanding that the purpose of truth is not to dominate others, embarrass them, or win an argument. The deeper purpose of truth is illumination. It helps reveal what was hidden beneath layers of confusion, assumption, or denial. When truth is used in this way, it becomes a tool for clarity rather than a weapon for conflict. This distinction may seem subtle, but it defines the difference between destructive confrontation and transformative insight. The moment you spoke your truth demonstrated that distinction. Your words were not chaotic or emotional outbursts meant to shock someone into submission. They carried structure. They carried observation. They reflected a period of reflection that had allowed you to understand the situation clearly before you chose to speak. This preparation is one of the most important aspects of responsible truth-telling. When someone speaks impulsively, their words often carry fragments of truth, mixed with frustration or personal bias. That combination can create confusion rather than clarity. But when truth is spoken from a place of thoughtful awareness, it tends to arrive with precision. The listener senses that the statement comes from observation rather than accusation. This makes the truth harder to dismiss because it aligns with patterns that can be seen rather than simply felt emotionally. Another element of responsibility lies in timing. Earlier in the journey, you already recognized how important timing was in allowing your words to land with impact. But timing also protects the truth itself from being misunderstood. When a person introduces clarity into a situation before others are ready to hear it, the message may be rejected, not because it is wrong, but because the environment has not yet developed the awareness necessary to receive it. Responsible truth-telling, therefore, requires patience. It involves observing the rhythm of a situation long enough to understand when the environment is approaching the point where honesty will illuminate rather than alienate. That patience is not weakness. In fact, it represents discipline. It shows that the speaker values the effectiveness of truth more than the immediate satisfaction of saying what is on their mind. When the right moment arrives, the words carry far greater influence because the surrounding circumstances allow them to reveal something that was already forming beneath the surface. This is exactly what happened in your experience. The truth you spoke aligned with a moment when the illusion surrounding the situation had begun weakening on its own. Your words did not force reality into existence. They revealed it at the moment when others were ready to see it. Responsibility also means recognizing the emotional impact that truth can have on those who hear it. When someone's perception shifts suddenly, they may experience a range of reactions, including surprise, confusion, defensiveness, or even relief. These reactions are part of the natural process of adjusting to a new understanding. A responsible truth-teller does not attempt to control those reactions, but they remain aware that the listener is moving through a transition. Instead of escalating tension or pushing for immediate agreement, they allow space for the listener to process what has been revealed. This patience demonstrates respect for the complexity of human perception. It acknowledges that understanding does not always happen instantly, even when the truth is clear. Over time, the listener begins integrating the new perspective into their interpretation of events. The clarity you introduced gradually becomes part of how they view the situation moving forward. Another important aspect of responsibility is humility. Even when someone recognizes patterns others have overlooked, humility keeps the focus on truth rather than personal validation. The goal is not to prove superiority or intellectual dominance. The goal is simply to illuminate reality. Humility ensures that the truth remains grounded in observation rather than ego. It also leaves room for continued learning because no single perspective captures every dimension of reality completely. By approaching truth with humility, the speaker remains open to further insight rather than assuming they possess the final interpretation of every situation. This attitude strengthens the credibility of their words because listeners sense that the speaker values accuracy more than personal pride. The responsibility of speaking truth also includes understanding that once clarity enters a conversation, it can influence others beyond the original listener. Truth often spreads through networks of awareness as people discuss and reflect on what they have learned. The insight you introduced may travel into other conversations, prompting additional reflections that gradually reshape the understanding of everyone connected to the situation. This ripple effect demonstrates why honesty delivered thoughtfully can transform environments far beyond a single moment. The influence of truth does not depend on repetition or persuasion. Its power lies in alignment with reality. Once people recognize that alignment, they begin adjusting their perceptions naturally. For you, realizing the impact of your words may bring a deeper awareness of your role in situations where confusion exists. You may find that others begin listening more closely when you speak, because they have seen how your observations reveal patterns they had not previously recognized. This does not mean you must constantly act as the voice of revelation in every conversation, but it does mean that your perspective carries weight when you choose to share it. With that weight comes the opportunity to use clarity in ways that encourage understanding rather than division. When truth is delivered responsibly, it does more than correct misunderstandings. It invites people into a clearer relationship with reality itself. And once that invitation is accepted, the environment around you gradually becomes more honest, more thoughtful, and more aware than it was before the moment when truth first entered the conversation. How truth changes the energy of a room begins with something subtle that many people feel but rarely analyze directly. Whenever a powerful truth enters a conversation, the atmosphere itself seems to change. The same people may still be sitting in the same positions, the same environment may surround them, and yet something within the space feels different. Conversations slow down. Silence appears more frequently. People become more careful about the words they choose. This shift is not imaginary. Human environments carry emotional and psychological energy created by the beliefs, expectations, and narratives that everyone present shares. When those narratives remain unchallenged, the atmosphere feels predictable because everyone is participating in the same interpretation of reality. But the moment a clear truth enters that environment, the shared narrative begins to shift. The room is no longer operating under the same assumptions that existed before. That change creates a ripple effect that influences how people think, speak, and interact with each other. When you spoke that earth-shattering truth, you did more than communicate an observation. You altered the emotional structure of the conversation itself. Before that moment, certain ideas may have been circulating freely because they were supported by the illusion everyone had been participating in. Those ideas felt safe to repeat because no one had challenged the underlying narrative that held them together. But once your statement exposed the deeper reality beneath the situation, those ideas suddenly lost their stability. People in the room began recognizing that the conversation could no longer continue in the same direction without acknowledging the truth that had just been revealed. This is why powerful honesty often creates a pause in social dynamics. The mind of every person present begins recalibrating how they interpret what is happening. Some individuals may react immediately by asking questions or expressing agreement, while others become quiet as they reconsider the assumptions they previously accepted. Regardless of their reaction, the environment has already changed. The conversation is no longer operating inside the old framework. Instead, it has entered a space where reality must be addressed more directly. That shift in atmosphere is what many people describe as an energetic change in the room. The word energy in this context does not refer to something mystical or abstract. It refers to the psychological alignment of the people involved. When a group shares the same narrative, the energy feels smooth because everyone is reinforcing the same understanding. When a truth disrupts that narrative, alignment temporarily dissolves as each person processes the new information. Some may accept it quickly because it matches observations they were already making internally. Others may resist it because it requires them to reconsider beliefs they have relied on for a long time. Yet even resistance cannot fully restore the original atmosphere. Once the truth has entered the conversation, the environment begins reorganizing itself around it, whether people consciously acknowledge it or not. This process often continues long after the original moment has passed. People leave the conversation carrying the truth with them into their private thoughts. Later that day, or even days afterward, they may revisit the moment in their mind, replaying the words and examining how they relate to earlier events. During this reflection, the clarity you introduced begins expanding. The listener may notice patterns in other situations that suddenly make more sense. Conversations they previously had with different people begin connecting to the insight you expressed. Gradually, the truth spreads through their awareness, like light moving through a space that once felt dim. Over time, this expanded awareness influences how they behave in future interactions. They become more attentive to inconsistencies, more cautious about accepting explanations that feel incomplete, and more appreciative of clarity when it appears. In this way, the shift in energy you created during that moment extends far beyond the room where the conversation originally took place. The influence travels through the thoughts and decisions of the people who experienced it. Another interesting effect of truth entering a room is the way it exposes authenticity within relationships. Before the truth appeared, certain dynamics may have been maintained through polite avoidance or mutual agreement not to question the narrative everyone was following. But once clarity disrupts that narrative, people begin revealing their genuine perspectives. Some individuals move closer to the truth because it aligns with their values and their desire for honesty. Others may distance themselves because the new reality challenges the position they previously occupied within the illusion. This differentiation can feel uncomfortable at first, yet it ultimately strengthens the integrity of the environment. Relationships built on honest understanding become more stable because they are no longer dependent on maintaining a fragile narrative. Instead, they grow from a shared commitment to acknowledging reality, even when it requires difficult conversations. Your role in initiating that shift may not have been intentional in terms of wanting to transform the atmosphere. You simply expressed what you observed to be true. Yet that act alone was enough to change the trajectory of the conversation. This demonstrates how powerful clarity can be when it enters a situation that has been surrounded by uncertainty. The words themselves may be brief, but the meaning they carry continues influencing how people interpret events long afterward. Over time, the environment begins stabilizing around the new understanding. The tension that initially appeared during the shift gradually settles as individuals adjust to the clearer perspective now available to them. Conversations become more grounded because participants are no longer navigating through confusion. Decisions become more thoughtful because they are based on accurate information rather than assumptions. The room that once felt uncertain now operates with a deeper level of awareness. This transformation illustrates one of the most important truths about honesty. Speaking clearly does not simply change a single moment. It changes the direction of future interactions. When people know that truth can be expressed openly within an environment, they become more attentive to reality rather than relying on narratives that obscure it. Over time, this creates a culture of clarity, where observation and honesty replace speculation and avoidance. The person who introduces that clarity therefore contributes more than they may realize. They help shift the environment toward greater understanding and authenticity. As you reflect on the moment when you spoke the truth that shifted someone's perception, it becomes clear that the impact extended far beyond the immediate reaction you observed. The energy of the room changed because reality itself had been brought into focus. The illusions that once guided the conversation lost their influence, and a clearer understanding began shaping the way people thought about the situation. That transformation may have started with a single statement, but its ripple effects continue unfolding in ways that reach far beyond the moment when the words were first spoken. As that shift in energy continued unfolding, another subtle transformation began taking place within the awareness of the people who witnessed the moment. Truth has a way of lingering in the atmosphere long after the original words fade from memory. Even when the conversation moves on to other topics, the clarity introduced by a powerful statement quietly remains in the background of people's thoughts. Individuals may find themselves reflecting on the moment later that evening, replaying the conversation internally as their mind continues processing what was revealed. During these private reflections, the implications of the truth often grow deeper. The listener begins noticing how the insight you shared explains not just the immediate situation, but also other interactions they had previously struggled to understand. Patterns become visible that once felt random or confusing. A conversation that once seemed insignificant suddenly appears meaningful because it now fits into a clearer narrative. This is how truth expands beyond the moment it was spoken. It continues organizing perception long after the discussion itself has ended. The shift you initiated, therefore, becomes part of a larger process of awareness that spreads gradually through observation and reflection. Another effect that begins appearing after the initial moment is the change in how people carry themselves around you. When someone witnesses a person articulate a truth that others avoided confronting, they often begin seeing that individual differently. The perception of your presence changes because your words demonstrated a level of awareness and courage that many people struggle to express. You may notice that certain individuals begin listening more carefully when you speak in future conversations. Others may approach you with questions about situations that require clarity because they recognize that you possess the ability to see patterns beneath the surface of events. This change in perception does not happen because you demanded attention or attempted to assert authority. It happens naturally because honesty creates credibility. When someone proves that their observations align with reality, people begin trusting that their perspective carries value. This trust forms the foundation of influence within any environment. Influence built on truth tends to be quiet but powerful. It does not rely on persuasion or forceful argument. Instead, it grows through consistent alignment between observation and reality. Over time, the clarity you introduced becomes part of how others understand the dynamics around them. They begin recognizing that illusions cannot survive indefinitely when someone is willing to articulate what is actually happening. In this way, the ripple effect of the truth you spoke continues moving through conversations, reflections, and decisions long after the moment itself has passed. The room where the truth was first spoken may return to its ordinary appearance, but the awareness within it has changed permanently. People now carry a deeper understanding of the situation, and that understanding influences how they interpret future events. The atmosphere has shifted because reality has been acknowledged. Once that acknowledgement occurs, it becomes very difficult for the environment to return fully to the illusion that existed before. When truth becomes the turning point, begins by bringing the entire journey back to the moment where everything changed. Because what appeared at first to be a simple statement was actually the catalyst for a deeper transformation in awareness. The truth you spoke did not simply interrupt a conversation. It interrupted an illusion that had been shaping how someone interpreted their reality for a long time. Before that moment, the environment surrounding the situation may have been filled with uncertainty, assumptions, and quiet contradictions that no one fully addressed. People often continue living inside these kinds of narratives because they provide a sense of stability, even when something inside them senses that the story is incomplete. Yet stability built on illusion is fragile, and eventually, a moment arrives when clarity enters the space and exposes what has been hidden beneath the surface. That moment arrived through your words. What made the moment powerful was not force or confrontation, but the precision of the observation itself. You spoke with a clarity that aligned perfectly with patterns that had already been forming quietly in the background of the situation. The person who heard you experienced the sudden realization that the story they had been relying on could no longer hold together the way it once did. In that instant, perception shifted. Past events began rearranging themselves into a clearer pattern, and confusion that had once felt difficult to explain started dissolving into understanding. Moments like this often become turning points in a person's awareness, because once the mind sees reality more clearly, it becomes very difficult to return to the illusion that existed before. Even if someone initially resists the implication of the truth, the clarity continues working within their thoughts. It grows through reflection, observation, and the gradual recognition of evidence supporting the insight that was revealed. Over time, the understanding becomes stronger than the narrative it replaced. The truth, therefore, does more than win an argument or prove a point. It transforms how someone navigates the world moving forward. This is the deeper significance of what happened when you spoke. Your words became the moment when awareness expanded and reality stepped forward to replace confusion. And although the conversation itself may have ended quickly, the ripple effect continues unfolding long after the words were spoken. The listener now carries a clearer understanding into future situations, noticing patterns they might have overlooked before, and interpreting events with a sharper perspective. At the same time, The experience reveals something important about your own role in environments where confusion exists. The ability to observe patterns, recognize truth, and express it with clarity is not a common skill. Many people sense inconsistencies, but hesitate to articulate them because they fear disruption or rejection. Yet the moment you spoke demonstrates that honesty delivered with awareness can create transformation rather than chaos. The truth did not destroy the situation, it illuminated it. It allowed reality to replace uncertainty, giving everyone involved the opportunity to see what was truly happening, rather than continuing to navigate through assumptions. In this way, the moment you experienced becomes more than an isolated conversation. It becomes an example of how powerful clarity can be when it enters a space that has been clouded by confusion. One clear observation can shift perception, reorganize understanding, and change the direction of future conversations. And as you move forward from that moment, the lesson remains clear. Truth, when spoken with intention and awareness, has the ability to reshape reality not by force, but simply by revealing what was already there, waiting to be seen.